It is indeed my pleasure. Well, I don't know if it's my pleasure to announce the closing remarks, because it seems that the conference has been quite nice and definitely very, very interesting. But as one of our previous speakers said, not once but several times, last but not least, it is now time for me to invite Alexia Bertrand, the Belgian Minister for the Budget and Consumer Protection since 2022. She has a lot of focus on consumer protection. She has launched B.Coco to help consumers think about their habits. She wants consumers to become, or to be.Coco, conscious consumers. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Mrs. Commissioner, Mr. President, dear Jean-Paul, ladies and gentlemen in the room and online. So first of all, you might be wondering what happened to my foot. I've been telling the official version up to now, but as you know, there's always an unofficial version in these cases, so I've kept it for you today. Actually, I was going to a TV program, told a colleague, and he sent me break a leg. So I literally did that, so now you know what to tell a colleague that you really don't like, right? But I'd like to take a minute to pause and take some distance to the last panel. And I must say, Mrs. Commissioner, and to the panelists, and also to Rohit Chopra, who is on stage, this was extremely refreshing. It's absolutely amazing. I have never heard anything like this before, and I've studied corporate law, been a corporate and financial lawyer for almost 10 years at the New York Bar, Brussels Bar, studied securities regulation in New York. But to hear you talk about resilience, about empathy, about not leaving people behind, about dementia, about financial inclusion, and with all the technical expertise, I really want to say that's the Europe we love. And I'm saying this as a liberal. That's the Europe we love. It's about, bringing Europe closer to the people, thinking not only about the policy, but thinking about how does this impact our communities? How does this impact our youth? How does this impact the older generation? And we've talked about dementia, and if I can do a little digression, I'd like to recommend an absolutely amazing documentary that I've seen yesterday called Human Forever. It's a young man from the Netherlands. He's 24. He's a nurse, and he's been for 3.5 years with dement people. He's been in a closed institution, and he's been around 11 countries to see how we treat dementia. And I think there's still a lot to do about our vision of society, but also in terms of financial services and inclusion. It's really life-changing, the documentary. So sorry for that digression, but it's something that I really recommend, because I do think we need to think about that. There are today 58 million people in the world with dementia. That number is going to increase massively towards 2050, so we're going to have to think about that. So thank you so much for that and for putting the focus and to the whole panel on financial education. It's so important, and Jean-Paul Servet with his whole team is doing an absolutely amazing work with the Wikifin Lab that I think is quite a premiere in the world, actually, talking about financial education in a very ludic way with games, having schools come, talking to the youth and really sharing information. And as you said, it's a real focus for me. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to conclude this conference on financial literacy, resilience, and you've talked about it, and inclusion. And let me first applaud this common initiative of the European Commission and of the FSMA during the Belgian presidency of the Council of the European Union. And I applaud you for giving everyone such a broad perspective of view, ranging from all the usual suspects, we know them, right? The academic world, the national banks, the FSMA, the European Commission, and members of the Belgian government, obviously, but also to other players, other speakers, such as Morocco, the OECD, the United States, and the youth perspective. Super interesting in this debate. Very high-level speakers, very interesting conference, I believe, and I hope each and every one of you has had an inspiring day, filled with valuable insights and new perspectives and new ways of thinking about financial education, financial services. As you might have understood from the interventions of the FSMA and my colleague, Vice Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Vincent van Petegem, financial education is one of the key priorities of the Belgian presidency. Minister van Petegem rightly stated that in order to put citizens' savings to work, we need to focus on greater participation by private investors in the financial markets. If we aim to mobilize private savings, financial literacy is crucial. And from his competence, Minister van Petegem intends to strengthen the financial literacy of the consumer investor. Within my competences, budget and consumer protection, I rather focus on every single consumer, whether they're able to save and invest or not. We know, and this has been confirmed again by the study of the OECD, that almost half of the adults in the EU lack sufficient knowledge of basic financial concepts. Can you imagine the implications that this has for both our future generations and our teenagers at this moment? So as it has been said, and thank you for reminding that, my slogan is Be Coco, so it's not a new beach cocktail. It's not an invitation to go Coco Loco. It's actually something that works in our country in the 3 languages. Be a conscious consumer, bewuste consument, consommateur, conscient. And it's the idea that you give the information and you sensitivize the consumer to make the right choices, who then can ask himself or herself the right question. What am I buying? Why am I buying it for? Where does my product come from? What is the implication? What is the impact of a product or a service on the environment, etc., etc. And therefore, obviously, consumers needs as much relevant information as possible that he can acquire on services and products. And I think the authorities needs to facilitate the information sharing. And thank you for saying we actually need to apologize for the rules being this complex. We should make them easier. That's our role as policymakers. But it's a question always of rights and duties. We have that role to make the rules less complex. The consumer also has a role to actually treat that information, to read it, and to make the right choices. But what is of use when you don't understand your own financial health, your financial resilience to start with? So my department has been advocating for several years the slogan, when it is too good to be true, well, it probably is not true. It's not true. In order to warn consumers of bad deals. But it's also essential to recognize that the offered product or services aren't always the problem. Sometimes it might be related to an individual's personal situation. We talked about it. And it can be unprivileged people because it's the circumstances or it's just not the right products or the right services for them, both in the short and the long term. And be mindful of the potential financial consequences that some choices might have in the longer term. So although most of this information lingers around somewhere in the massive amount of administrative paperwork that we've accumulated over the years, or can be found on the millions of pages on the internet, most people aren't actively aware of their financial health. Furthermore, as you know, our financial health can be different now, in 6 months' time, or 5 years down the road. And if we look closely, we see that we often take financial decisions that might bind us for the next month or years. So the passive information is around, but many people, adults or not, are not actively processing this information. In my family, we used to have a slogan, it was actually my father who would say this, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. We used to laugh a lot about this. This was usually during the exam time. But actually, this is what it's all about. So why don't we always take care of our own finances in an informed and prepared way? Is it because we're not open to speak about finances? Are we afraid to discuss money and salaries? Do we fear for our image when we talk to friends that we will be able to talk to friends about choices on insurance, loans, or debts? Do we always assume that there will be, the day we need them, an expert to consult? And how expensive are these experts? When we're confronted with active information on financial information, It often comes in the form of TV spots promoting how easy it is to get a loan for your next car or house. And another channel of information seems to be, especially for young people, social media, where finfluencers share insights. Finfluencers who often start by saying that whatever they state is not a financial advice in order to avoid legal consequences. On a personal note, I might invite us all to take a moment in the coming days to think about how many times do we speak to our children, to our parents, to our friends about financial decisions. Do we feel comfortable with it? Since we're all experts in our own way, we could contribute to general financial literacy by sharing in an informal way the knowledge we might have. And if you've been taught, like I have, never to discuss religion, sex, politics, or money, as the old saying goes, let's just decide it's no longer the greater good as far as money is concerned. I'll leave it to you for the other topics. On my end, I continue to visit schools in my school tour on the subject of financial literacy, and a big part of my attention goes to budgeting, goes to topics such as money mules, we've just talked about them, but also influencer marketing. And I noticed that for some students, I bring useful information, and I really hope it encourages them to think critically. Therefore, it might not surprise you that on the Consumer Dialogue on 18 April and the informal ministerial meeting on 19 April, financial education and influencer marketing are some of the hot topics that we put on the agenda. This conference, with its many best practices and meaningful insights, will serve as a solid basis for discussion during these days. In the coming days, the Belgian presidency will address several questions on both topics to the member states in order to have a constructive discussion on how to prioritize them on the agenda of the next European Commission and to exchange best practices. My colleagues, national ministers competent for consumer protection, and myself will keep this high on the agenda. We want to reinforce our consumers of all ages and in all decisions they might take. So once again, thank you so much for this conference, and I hope that all participants on or offline will bring new ideas at home and implement them, or just talk to their inner circle on financial literacy, and don't be afraid to talk about money. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, before our absolute final words, a little more housekeeping. Afterwards, there is indeed a networking reception that you're all invited to. I'm sure the staff will direct you to it. So on my behalf, I'd like to say that it was very pleasant being on this voyage today with you. I found the conference very, very interesting and very understandable, which is saying something. So thank you, and I would like to invite Commissioner McGuinness to close the conference.
I think we should give a round of applause for Iris. It's the wonderful. I just want to say a few words, really, that this was almost self-indulgent, this topic for me. I've been talking about it for a long time. We met kindred spirits in FSMA, who worked incredibly hard with FISMA, FISMA, to produce what I believe has been an extraordinary range of speakers and topics here today. And thank you, Jean-Paul, for that. And you've been with us all day. That's hugely appreciated. I've stayed the course because too often we have to leave conferences and we miss the core. And in fact, I go out of this conference not with answers, but with many more questions that we need to try and find answers to in an ever-evolving financial space. I'm also very confident that we can do that because there's so many people interested in finding solutions to some of the problems we've raised. I want to thank those of you who are in the room with us still, because this is extraordinary. Usually at this point, certainly the front rows are usually empty, but this is good. You're in the front row. And to those who've joined us online, thank you so much for taking part in this. The world is changing rapidly and finance is changing, sometimes for the better, sometimes not so. But at least we're aware of it. I think having the voices from other places than just Europe added hugely to this conference. And thank you to both our colleagues from Morocco, the US and the OECD, who brought a hugely different dimension. Lastly, to say that we will continue this conversation with the finance ministers in the informal ECOFIN at the end of this week. That's huge progress, and we'll have conclusions. First time ever. So we're making history, and we need to. We want to put the bad things behind us and build a future where there is resilience and inclusion based on quality information and access to it. And indeed, maybe to add what was mentioned in the last panel, that not to shame people who make mistakes, because hands up those of us who've never made a mistake, but rather we learn from them. So for me, this has been a great moment. I said at the introduction that for me, it was perhaps the most important conference, and I still feel that. I think we did great work together in digging under the surface of an incredibly complex set of questions. But if we get there, if we solve these problems, the societal benefits are absolutely enormous. Enough of me. Have a lovely evening and join us for the end. Thank you.